Charles Hamilton Houston, a lawyer, teacher, and mentor, laid the groundwork to destroy the legal precedent of segregation. His blueprint propelled his former student, Thurgood Marshall, in front of the Supreme Court to argue the case of Brown versus Board, a case that decided the fate of segregation across America. Charles Hamilton Houston was born on September 3, 1895. Less than a year later, the Supreme Court would make a decision that Houston would dedicate his life to fighting. This case, known as Plessy versus Ferguson, left a legal stain on the American courts, and this stain would be challenging to remove. This is because the American legal system runs under the idea of precedence. When a court makes a decision, it doesn't just look to the text of the laws. It looks to how other judges made decisions in the past. To some degree, court decisions themselves can become pseudo-law, like in the recent case of Obergefell versus Hodges, which made same-sex marriage legal across all of America. In 1896, the legal precedent that ruled over civil rights was the case of Plessy versus Ferguson. This case made segregation completely legal on the condition that theoretically equal facilities were provided for each race. This separate but equal doctrine ruled over every aspect of Black Americans' lives, and Houston was acutely aware of how this doctrine worked and failed to work. For most of Houston's young life, he lived sheltered from the burden of racism. His parents had significant amounts of money and were able to keep him in a more secluded neighborhood around D.C. with other more wealthy Black families. He was woken to the real toll of segregation when he decided to fight in World War II. He volunteered to become an officer and went to the newly created training camp in Iowa, dedicated to training Black officers. Even though Houston and the other future officers volunteered to fight for the U.S., it was clear they were seen as second-class citizens. The trainers at the camp, under directions from the Department of Defense, explicitly skipped over training like artillery training and engineering training because they claimed the Black people were not educated enough to handle it. When Houston and the others finally finished the training, the Department of Defense then assigned them to spots they were wildly untrained for. And this move put Black soldiers' lives at serious risk. Houston's struggle did not get any better when he made it to the European theater. Black officers were forced out of the mess hall designated for officers and forced to eat out of the kitchens. Black officers were threatened with lynching from other white officers. The toxic ooze of racism, both systemic and personal, hardened Houston, and he knew he needed to destroy this legal precedent that supported racism. When Houston got back from the war, he enrolled in Harvard Law School, getting his law degree and further getting the equivalent of a PhD in law. Houston was now armed with the tools to fight segregation. He just needed an army, and Houston was offered the opportunity to help build one at Howard Law School. The first Black president of Howard knew he needed to build up the law school, and he hired Houston to be the dean. At the time, Howard Law School was one of the best schools for future Black lawyers, but it was nowhere near as good as competing schools for white people. At the time, the school was only a night school, making it hard to train the most serious of students, and as the years went by, professors of Howard Law had gotten complacent. Houston hit the ground running as dean. He began firing professors who were complacent, or he pressured them to resign. And after raising the staff, he was able to hire extremely qualified Black professors who were barred from working at other schools only on the basis of race. With these new staff, Houston turned the law school into a well-oiled machine. He oversaw all the classes, and with the centralized control of the classes, Houston was able to hold both teachers and students to a higher standard. He was able to remove inefficiencies from the system, like cutting classes which concepts could be better covered in others. Houston also made reforms that communicated a higher standard that he was looking for. Houston made certain that professors forced the students to follow every little rule, like much stronger enforcement of tardiness. He also communicated this higher standard in more subtle, psychological ways. For example, he told his staff that they should be doing some of their work in the library as a show of camaraderie with his students. After making these changes, Houston finally put down the night school and turned Howard Law School into a school only committed to making extremely qualified Black lawyers. Houston's harshness was not without reason. Houston's held his students and staff to this high standard because it's the exact same high standard that the courts will hold these African American lawyers to because of their race. Judges would be looking for any chance to discount them, and Houston would not allow them to be. Houston knew any mistake in the legal fight for civil rights could set the process back years due to the precedent set. Houston joked, quote, "Doctors can bury their mistakes. Lawyers cannot." Houston's reforms earned the school full accreditation from the American Bar Association, and this vindicated some of the more aggressive choices Houston had to make. But this did not stop Houston's drive to continue improving the law school. His drive to create qualified Black lawyers led him to make curriculum changes. He wanted to leave one major theme running through the students' whole education: becoming social engineers. Houston's so-called social engineers were designed to help fight in the courts for things like civil rights or the destruction of segregation. Now, Houston's creation of these social engineers had 3 critical steps. Step 1, learn the law. This consisted of reading books, knowing all the case law, and all the precedents. Step 2 was being able to think like a lawyer, knowing how to think critically about the law and how to use it in the courtroom. And then step 3 would be teaching students how to use the law to change the law. Houston wanted his social engineers to both understand the weight that precedent had on all court cases, but also how precedent can be shaped by a clever enough lawyer. Houston wanted all students to know what the law and the precedent should be, and by knowing that, a lawyer could shift how the law was applied in the courts. Not all of Houston's great teaching came in the classroom. From Howard's privileged location in Washington, D.C., Houston was able to take the students to the U.S. Attorney's Office, the FBI headquarters, and various courtrooms to remind students that these cases they were reading about in books were happening in the real world. For some students, like Thurgood Marshall, Houston was able to take the real-world teaching a step further. When the NAACP wanted Houston to defend a client in a murder trial, Houston brought his students, Thurgood Marshall and Edward Lovett, to help him prepare and try this case. The case was a murder trial for George Crawford, a black man. Houston and the NAACP didn't just join the case to try to save Crawford from death row. They were also aiming for something bigger: jury reform. Houston argued that the jury in the Crawford case was made up specifically of white people. In fact, the state of Virginia had never had a jury where black people had served on it, and only 1 or 2 black people were ever put into the jury pool, even though they were more than qualified to serve on a jury. Houston, along with his mentees, Thurgood and Lovett, were able to save Crawford from death row. Crawford was given life in prison instead. This disheartening conclusion to a trial was actually a huge victory for the NAACP, and after this trial, the counties in Virginia began to include more black people into their jury pools. This personal experience was able to show Thurgood how you could masterfully be a social engineer to be able to protect both your client and the rights of many other future clients. Even after graduating from Howard, Marshall continued to collaborate with Houston. A year after graduating from Howard, Marshall was working on a case with Houston for the NAACP, this time focused on fighting segregation in the school system. This was Marshall's first big case out of law school, and it would be the precursor to the case that would define Marshall's career. Marshall and Houston's convincing arguments were able to let a black student be admitted into the white Maryland Law School. Houston, Marshall, and the NAACP would continue to fight Plessy versus Ferguson and the segregation that separate but equal doctrine supported. They did this by focusing on education. Houston did this for 2 main reasons. Number 1, he knew that it would be impossible for the states to provide 2 segregated schools of equal quality, and as such, he knew he could force them into desegregation just because the costs of actually following this separate but equal doctrine would be way too high. Secondly, he knew that eventually they would be able to argue that it's impossible for schools to ever be separate but equal. Being in a school without people of other races will always produce inequality. Just the act of separating builds inequality and prejudice. Thurgood Marshall and Charles Houston continued to work together on cases for the NAACP. Thurgood rose up in the NAACP, eventually forming the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. Marshall and Hamilton worked together to pick away at the precedent of Plessy until April 2, 1950, when Houston died of a sudden heart attack at the age of 54. Even though Houston died, his fight against Plessy lived on through his student Thurgood Marshall and the lawyers of the NAACP. Houston's legal strategy of slowly chipping away at Plessy by working through the educational system continued. Thurgood Marshall was able to use that blueprint laid out by Houston. By following all the skills the great teacher taught him, he was able to argue in front of the Supreme Court the case of Brown versus Board. With Thurgood's victory in that case, he completed Houston's crusade to destroy the legal precedent of Plessy, showing that there was no way that separate but equal could ever truly be equal. The case of Brown versus Board resulted in the destruction of legal segregation in both schools and the entirety of America. Charles Houston's teaching style, focusing on producing lawyers to fight for the rights of African Americans, was a grand success. Houston's plan of teaching to fight through the legal process was fulfilled by his student Thurgood Marshall when he finally defeated the racist legal doctrine of Plessy.